The chain came off the gate at 4:40 in the morning, and Del Mercer stood there, in the cold, with the loose end in his glove, and understood that something had lifted it, not broken it. The padlock hung open on the post where he had locked it the night before. He had carried the only key in his coat for 9 years. The links were not cut. They were unthreaded, looped back over the top rail in a neat coil, the way a man stacks rope he means to use again. Del looked at that coil for a long time. His breath stood white in the truck's headlights and went nowhere. Then he looked past the gate, up the grade where Burnt Hollow Road climbed into the tree line. And he did not see anything. And the not seeing was worse than a shape would have been. He got back in the truck. He did not unlock the gate. He sat with the heater running and the radio off and watched the dark until the dark gave up nothing. And he told himself, the way he would tell himself many things in the weeks to come, that there was a reason for it he had not thought of yet. Del ran water and pumps for the county on the east side, out past where the pavement gave up and the township roads took over. He was 51 years old, and he had spent 30 of those years putting his hands on things that broke. He knew the sound a bad bearing made before the gauge knew it, a faint, dry whine, half a step under the motor's normal note. And he had learned to trust that whine over the gauge every time, because the gauge told you a thing had already failed. He knew which culverts backed up in a hard rain and which ones held. He knew the station's old jockey pump cycled 4 times an hour in dry weather and 6 in wet, and that when it cycled 8 something was leaking somewhere downhill, and he had better go find it before a well house froze. He kept a logbook in the truck with a carpenter pencil tied to it by a string. And in that book he wrote pressures and flow rates, and the dates he greased the valve stems, because a man who guessed instead of wrote was a man who eventually flooded a basement. He did not panic on ice. He did not cut blind corners on the township roads, did not invent reasons for things he could not yet explain, did not let a problem stay a guess when a wrench in an hour would make it a fact. People in the township knew him as the one who showed up. When the Hollis girl ran her car into the creek, in March he had been the one out there at 2 in the morning with a chain and a come-along, and he had not told the story of it once after, not at the fire hall, not at the diner, because the doing of it was the whole of it, and the telling added nothing. He did not exaggerate. He did not tell stories about the bear he almost shot, or the time the road washed out under him. When Del said a thing happened, the men who knew him took it as fact, because he had spent his whole life making his word worth that, and a word built that slow is not a thing a man spends on a story he is not sure of. He lived with his wife Renata in a frame house a quarter-mile down from the pump station, on a lot his father had cleared. Their daughter was grown and gone to Columbus, but she had left them the baby for 3 weeks while she finished a travel contract at a hospital downtown, and so the house held a crib again for the first time in 26 years. The baby was 7 months old. Her name was Wren. She slept in the back room that had been their daughter's, in a sleep sack printed with small foxes, under a window that looked uphill toward the hollow. Renata had hung a monitor on the wall above the crib, a little plastic camera that fed a screen on the kitchen counter, and at night the screen glowed green and showed the baby breathing, and that glow became, without anyone deciding it, the last light they turned off. The morning of the chain, Del told Renata about the gate while she made coffee. He kept it flat. He said somebody had been messing around up by the station, and he was going to keep an eye on it. She watched his face the way she had watched it for 30 years, and she did not believe the small version of what he said, but she let it stand, because that was their arrangement. He brought her the truth in pieces she could carry. She took the pieces and waited for the rest. The rest started with the dogs 3 nights later. There were 2 of them, a pair of mixed-heeler shepherds named Boone and Settle, that Dell kept for company and for the early warning a dog gives on a property like that. Boone was the older gray, coming in around his muzzle, slow to rise and slower to forgive a stranger. Settle was younger and softer and barked at her own shadow on the barn wall. They slept on the porch on a pad of old quilts, and they barked at coyotes and at the UPS man and at nothing at all, the way dogs do, and Dell had learned over 9 years to read the difference in their barking the way he read a gauge. The short, sharp one for a car in the drive and the long, rolling one for something moving on the ridge. On the third night after the chain, they did not bark. Dell came awake at 2:13 in the morning with no sound to point to, only the absence of the small sounds the house made, the tick of the baseboard heat and the settle of the old frame, and he lay in the dark and listened and could not hear the dogs. Not whining, not moving, nothing. He got up without turning on a light. The floor was cold through his socks, and he went down the hall by feel, one hand on the wall, the way he had walked it 10,000 times. He went to the front window and looked down at the porch and saw both dogs pressed flat against the boards under the swing. Not asleep, not hurt, just flattened their bellies to the wood and their legs folded under them and their eyes open. Neither of them so much as turned an ear toward the window when he tapped the glass with one knuckle. He tapped again, harder, and Settle's eye rolled to him for a half-second and went back to the trees. And that was worse than no response at all, because it told him the dog had heard him and made a choice, and the choice was that whatever was up the hill mattered more than the man who fed her. He had never in 9 years seen them do that. A dog that smells a bear stands its ground and makes noise. A dog that smells fire runs. A dog that hears a coyote answers it. These two had gone low and silent in a way Dell had only ever seen once, years back, in a heeler that had crawled under a porch in a lightning storm and would not come out for anything. The posture of an animal that has decided that the safest thing it can do is make itself small and still and absent and wait for the thing to pass. He stood at the window a while. He told himself it was a cat or a bear come down early, or the neighbor's stud horse loose again. He ran through the list the way he ran through a startup checklist on a cold pump. And at the end of the list he was standing at the same window with the same dogs flattened below him, and not one item on the list explained why they would not look away from the trees. He went back to bed. He did not sleep. Around 4, the dogs came back to themselves, and he heard them shift and resettle on the quilts, and only then did the night sound right again. In the morning he walked the tree line above the road before work. The ground up there was soft from a week of rain, salal and fern matted down along the old skid trail his father had cut for firewood. Dell read ground for a living, in the small way that any man does who works outside. He could tell a deer trail from a coyote run, could tell how old a track was by how the rain had worked its edges. 40 feet up the slope, where the skid trail bent around a stump, he found where something had stood. The ferns were pressed in a flat oval, the size of a truck hood. Inside the oval, the ground was bare, and in the bare ground was a single track that the rain had not yet softened, which meant it was newer than the rain, which meant it was from the night before. He crouched over it. It was a print, and it was wrong. It had the shape of a foot that walked on 2 legs longer than a man's, with the weight thrown forward onto a broad pad and 4 deep points at the front where claws had pushed into the dirt and dragged. He took the carpenter pencil from his pocket and laid it across the print for scale, and the print swallowed the pencil. He went back to the truck and brought up the tape, the wide yellow one he used for pipe runs, and he measured it the way he measured everything. Flat and careful, reading the number off the blade, and saying it once under his breath before he wrote it. 14 inches heel to claw, 6 inches across the ball. He pressed his own thumb into the soft ground beside it and watched how shallow his thumb went, and then looked again at how deep the claw points had driven a full inch into ground that barely took his thumbnail. And he did the arithmetic of weight the way he did the arithmetic of water pressure, and the answer the ground gave him was a number he did not like. The depth of the claw points told him the thing had weight behind it. Real weight, the kind that drove a heel into wet ground and held. He photographed it with his phone, and hated how the phone made it look small and ordinary, a smear of mud that could have been anything, a root, a slumped clod, a trick of the gray light when his eye, standing over it, knew it was not anything. He set the pencil in the frame and shot it again so the scale would be in the picture, and even then the picture lied, flattened it, made it a thing a man could scroll past. There was only the one print. He cast up and down the skid trail for the next one, walking slow with his eyes on the ground the way he walked a leak, and the next soft place was 11 feet on, smooth and unbroken, and the place after that another 9, and nothing between them was disturbed, no scuff, no second heel, no place a long stride had touched down. Whatever had stood there had stood on 2 legs and watched the house, and then it had crossed the bare ground in a single stride he could not find the far end of, because nothing that walked on 2 legs covered 11 feet in a step, and he stood there in the wet ferns turning that over, and could not make it come out to anything but what it was. He did not tell Renata about the track. He told her he wanted the baby to sleep in their room for a while, and when she asked why he said the back room got cold, and they both heard the lie land on the kitchen table between them, he called the county game officer that week. He did it from the truck, on his lunch, with the logbook open on his knee. He gave it straight. He said he had a large predator working his property at night, that it had moved a chain and pressed down a bedding spot, and left a track he had measured at 14 inches, and that his dogs would not face it. The officer was a young man named Petrak, who Dell had met once at a culvert washout. Petrak was decent, and he was honest about being useless. He said it sounded like a bear, that bears stood on their hind legs and left big tracks and got into latches, that 14 inches was at the top end, but not impossible for a boar in a wet year. He said he could come out in 8 or 9 days when he finished a poaching file over in the next county. Dell said that would be fine. He wrote the date in the logbook. He did not believe it was a bear, and Petrak did not quite believe his own explanation either. But the explanation was a thing they could both hold on to. And so they held it, and the call ended, and Dell sat in the truck with the engine ticking and understood that no one was coming in time for whatever this was. The nights stacked up after that, each one starting a little higher than the last. The 4th night, the dogs flattened again, and this time Dell was already awake, sitting in the kitchen with the monitor screen and a cup of coffee gone cold. And he watched the green glow and listened to the silence. He had learned a pattern now. First, the coyotes quit, the ones that yipped most nights from the ridge across the creek. Then the small things, the field mice in the wall and the moth at the porch light, went still. Then the dogs went low. The silence moved down the hill toward the house in a front he could almost time, and when it reached the porch, the dogs disappeared into themselves, and the only sound left in the world was the baby breathing on the little speaker, and Dell's own heart, which he could hear now, which he did not like. That night, the smell came. It rode in under the back door on the cold, and it was rank and wet and animal, like a wet dog rolled in something dead, but stronger with an edge under it that Dell's body reacted to before his mind named it. The hair on his arm stood up under his sleeves. His mouth went dry, and his hands went cold at the same time, the way they did once on a ladder when a rung gave. the body knowing the danger a full second ahead of the thought. He had skinned deer and hauled roadkill off the township roads in August, the swollen ones the heat had worked on, and he knew what dead smelled like. And this was not quite that. This was a live thing that smelled of carrion, hot and present and moving, which was a combination his nose had never been asked to file before, and the not being able to file it was its own alarm. Porrid. He stood up slow, the chair legs quiet on the floor because he set them down with care. He did not turn on the porch light. He went to the back window and looked out at the yard and the slope beyond it. And at the top of the slope, just inside the tree line where the dark went solid, he saw the eyes. They were amber. They caught what little light came off the kitchen window and threw it back, 2 points of it, steady, and they were too far apart and too high off the ground. He knew the height of a deer's eye and the height of a coyote's and the height of a man's, knew them the way he knew the height of a hydrant, by years of seeing them at those heights, and these were above the height of his own eyes, when he stood at his full height, by a foot or better, set wide, wider than his 2 fists held together at arm's length. They did not blink the way a deer's eyes blink, the slow wet shudder of a grazing animal that looks up and goes back to feeding. They held. They were not startled by him. They were measuring. He understood in that moment, standing at his own back window, with his hand flat on the cold glass and his heart going hard and even under his shirt, that he was being looked at by something that had decided to let him see it, and that the looking was not the start of a charge. It was an appraisal. It was the look a man gives, a fence he intends to come through later when he has the time and the weather and no one watching. The look that takes the measure of a thing and files it and moves on. Dell did not move, and the eyes did not move, and the two of them held that line across 40 feet of dark, for what the kitchen clock later told him was 19 minutes. Then the eyes lowered smooth, the way a head lowers, and they were gone, and the smell thinned, and a minute after that the dogs lifted their heads off the porch boards, and the night came back. He stood at the window until first light. Dawn came up gray and slow over the hollow, and proved nothing at all. In the daylight, the slope was just a slope, wet ferns, and the gray trunks and the skid trail bending around the stump, and a man driving past on the road would have seen a quiet wooded hill and thought it was a fine place to live. He started preparing the way. He prepared for a hard freeze, methodically, without drama. He brought the shotgun up from the basement, a pump 12 gauge that had been his father's, the bluing worn silver along the slide where 2 men's hands had worked it over 50 years, and he cleaned it at the kitchen table while Renata watched, running the brush through the bore and oiling the action. And he loaded it with slugs, and stood it in the corner by the back door where he could reach it in 1 step from the table. He did not think the shotgun would matter. He cleaned it anyway, because cleaning it was a thing his hands knew how to do, and his hands needed something to do that ended in a thing being ready. He bought a work light, a big LED flood on a tripod that ran off a deep cycle battery, the kind the road crew used at night washouts, and he set it in the yard angled up the slope, and he ran the switch on a length of lamp cord back to a nail by the porch door so he could throw the whole hill into white light from inside without stepping out. He tested it once at dusk, and the slope leapt out of the gray. All at once every fern lit flat, and he stood looking at it and thought that it was a good light, and that a good light might not be the kind of thing that helped here, and he left it set, anyway. He put a road flare in each coat pocket and one on the windowsill in the baby's old room, the fat red ones from the truck that struck like a match and burned a hand's length of fire for 20 minutes in any weather, the one light that did not run on a battery, a thing could turn and did not throw from a fixture, a light a man held in his fist and carried. He walked the property line in the daylight and noted the soft spots where a thing would have to cross to reach the house from the trees. The low place by the old fence corner, the bare run below the stump, the mud at the edge of the mowed grass, and he checked them each morning before he left for the pumps. Walking the line with his coffee going cold in his hand and his eyes down in the logbook in the truck, filled with dates and measurements that had nothing to do with water, a column of numbers a stranger would have read as a man losing his grip, and that Dell read as the only sane response left to him, which was to keep writing it down, to keep the record straight, to stay the man who wrote instead of guessed, even when what he was writing down was a thing no gauge would ever confirm. Renata stopped asking him to say the small version. One night she sat across from him at the table and said plainly, "What is it?" And he set down the pencil and told her the truth in the flat voice he used for facts. He said he did not know what it was. He said it walked on 2 legs, and it was bigger than a man, and it had been watching the house for 2 weeks, and it was patient in a way that animals were not supposed to be. He said he had measured a track at 14 inches and seen eyes set wider than his own hands could span, and that the dogs would not face it. He did not name it because he had no name for it, that he would put his hand on a Bible behind, and naming it would have been a kind of exaggeration, and he had spent 51 years not being a man who exaggerated. And Renata listened with both hands around her cup. When he finished, she did not cry and she did not argue. She said, "Then we keep her in the middle of the house, and we keep the light where you can reach it, and we do not go out after dark." It was the most sensible plan anyone could have made, and Dell loved her for making it, and he knew the way he knew bad bearings, that the thing on the hill had already counted their doors. The week after that, the evidence changed character, and that was the thing that frightened Dell most, because it meant the thing was thinking. It started with the work light. He went out one morning to check the battery, and found the flood turned to face the house. He had angled it up the slope. It now pointed at the back door square on, the tripod leg shifted in the mud, and around the base of the tripod the ground was printed with the same broad 2-legged track, 3 of them this time, close. Dell stood in the yard, with the cold coming through his coat, and looked at his own light, aimed back at his own door, and understood that it had taken his preparation and turned it into a message. It had not broken a light. It had not knocked it down. It had aimed it. A bear did not aim a light. A bear did not understand that a light was a thing a man used, and that pointing it back at him was a way of saying, "I see what you are doing, and it will not be enough." He moved the crib again that day into the windowless hall closet they had cleared and lined with quilts, and Renata slept on the floor of the hall outside it with the door open, and Dell sat up in the kitchen with the shotgun across his knees and the monitor glowing and the flare on the sill. The nights ran together. The silence came down the hill, on its schedule. Some nights the eyes were at the tree line, and some nights they were not. And the not knowing which it would be was its own kind of weight. He stopped sleeping in any real way. He took it in pieces in the daylight, an hour on the couch, with the doors locked, and the dogs awake. And he ran the pumps in a fog and made no mistakes, because 30 years of habit ran the pumps for him. Petrak came on the 9th day, in daylight, in his green truck, and he was sorry, and he was honest, and he was no help at all. Dell took him up the slope and showed him the bedding oval, and the soft spots, and the one old track that the rain had finally started to work at the edges. Petrak crouched over the track a long time. He was not a fool. Dell watched him do the same thing Dell had done. Watched him reach for bear and not quite close his hand around it. Watched the cost-free explanation fail in a man's face in real time. Petrak measured the track himself and got 14 inches and did not say bear again. He stayed crouched over it longer than he needed to, and when he stood, his knees cracked and he looked up the slope toward the tree line and then back down at the house and the yard and the porch where the dogs lay watching him, and Dell saw him take the measure of the place and not like the sum of it. He said he would file a report. He said he would ask around about livestock kills in the area. He said in the voice of a man who knew he was failing that if Dell saw it again, he should call dispatch, and they would send a deputy, and all three of them, Dell and Petrak and the deputy who was not there, knew that a deputy from the county seat was 40 minutes out on a good night, and that 40 minutes was several lifetimes in the dark. Petrak left before dusk. He did not want to be on Burnt Hollow Road after dark, and he did not pretend otherwise, and Dell respected him for the honesty, even as the green truck's taillights went down the grade and left him alone with it again. The carcass came on a Tuesday. Dell found it at the edge of the yard at first light, a yearling deer, and he made himself look at it the way he made himself look at every hard thing, straight and without flinching. The deer had not been eaten. That was the wrong of it. A coyote kill was torn and scattered, and worked over for the soft parts, the belly opened, the haunches pulled. A bear kill was buried under leaves and dirt and come back to. This deer had been killed and set down at the edge of the mowed grass, intact, facing the house, its legs folded under it almost neatly, the way a deer folds them, to lie down in tall grass on a warm afternoon, as if it had been arranged that way by something that had handled it without hurry. There was a single wound at the base of the skull and nothing else, no feeding, no waste, no blood spread wide, and Dell crouched over it the way he had crouched over the track, and did not touch it and read it the only way it could be read. The placement of it at the exact line where the wild ground met the kept ground was a sentence he could understand without wanting to. It was a gift, or a demonstration, or a warning, and it did not matter which, because all three meant the same thing. The thing on the hill could take what it wanted, and it wanted Dell to know. He buried the deer himself with the tractor before Renata woke deep at the far corner of the lot, and he said nothing about it. And that was the first thing in 30 years of marriage he kept whole from her, and he kept it because there was nothing she could do with it but be afraid, and her fear would not help the baby. The monitor was how it got inside. It was past 3 on a Thursday morning, the worst stretch of the worst week, and Dell was at the kitchen table with the screen glowing green and the baby breathing on the little speaker, and the dogs had been flat and silent for an hour. He had stopped going to the window. He had learned that looking did no good, that the eyes would be there or they would not, and that the thing fed on being watched, the way a fire feeds on a draft. So he sat with his back to the door and his hands on the shotgun and his eyes on the green screen where the baby slept, in her sack of foxes in the lined closet, and he held the line by not moving, and that was when the speaker changed. Under the soft sound of the baby breathing, a second sound came onto the channel. It was low, below where the little speaker should have been able to carry, a bass rumble that Dell felt in the table under his forearms before he fully heard it, and riding on top of the rumble was a faster sound, a dry, chattering vibration, the two of them braided together in a way that no single throat Dell knew of could make. It was the sound of two throats working in one chest. It came through the monitor, which meant it was close to the closet, which meant it was against the wall of his own house on the outside, at the exact spot where his granddaughter slept, and it had found the frequency. It was not in the yard. It was at the wall. And it had reached through the one device they had trusted to keep her in sight, and put its voice into the middle of the house. Dell was up and moving before the thought finished. and he did not feel his body do it the way he had not felt it move at the back window. He crossed the kitchen and the hall in the dark, and he did not turn on a light because light was a thing it understood, and dark was not where its advantage lay tonight. Tonight the advantage was that this was his house, and he knew every board of it blind. Renata was already sitting up in the hall, with the closet door pulled almost shut and her body between it and the room, and her face in the green wash from the kitchen was white and still and entirely awake, and she did not make a sound. The rumble was coming through the outside wall now without the speaker, low and physical, and the chattering rode